Tonight we are very blessed that on this Shabbat in which we honor our veterans, that we have a storyteller in our midst who has for the night the title of Rav, teacher. Because Daniel M. Cohen has spent most of his adult life doing what rabbis do, telling stories. He's done it as a journalist. He's done it as a filmmaker. He's done it with extraordinary talent. He has worked on films called The Whole Truth, The Diamond Men, and he has written comedy at times. And if you have the opportunity to pick up the book that he will speak on tonight, you'll understand that this man's genre is understanding the human soul. In September of 2005, I do not know why, but during those years, I happened to be a favorite son of the Bush administration, which is a little bit strange because I'm a child whose father ran Albert Gore Sr.'s campaign for the American auto workers, a Democrat through and true. But Bush, too, had a special sense of wanting to include local rabbis like no other president before him or no other president since him has done. And because of that, I had the pleasure of being in the White House an inordinate amount of times. In September of 2005, I was invited, and I got to witness the moment that our speaker's book is about. And that is the moment and the story of how one man, a Holocaust survivor, who then became a soldier, is the only Holocaust survivor who 25 years after received the Medal of Honor. It is with great pleasure that I present to you our speaker this night, the author and the storyteller of Ted Rubin's story, Single-Handed, our guest this evening, Daniel M. Cohen.
So, thank you very much, Rabbi Lustig, and the organization that brought me here tonight. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be speaking here and to be able to tell this story. It was quite a privilege to work on it and to get to know Teddy over 2 years and the other people around him, so many of them heroes. So, and actually, I didn't expect so many people, and I was going to try and go without a net, but when I saw you all, I chickened out and ran for my notes. So I am still rather shocked that there are so many of you. Now, first of all, how many of you know just a little bit or anything about Teddy Rubin? Well, of course, you're cheating. A few of you. Okay, cool. So largely then, let me make a proposition to you and ask you to consider it for a minute. Think about this. A kid who was taken to a Nazi concentration camp later joins the U.S. Army and then in another war becomes a prisoner of the Chinese for 2.5 years and then actually 50 years later gets the Medal of Honor. He is the only one to have reached that kind of an achievement. And I have to say, frankly, when I first met him back in 2011, I found it very hard to accept, looking at him, that any one human can do that. Now, let me tell you what it was like. I'd heard about his heroics. I heard about his experience. A rabbi told me they needed somebody to write a story. I go and meet the guy. In my mind, it's like kind of a Jewish John Wayne. And I'm waiting for some stoic guy with an accent. He's a Hungarian. He's going to, kind of bully me around. And, he's done everything. He's almost like a Superman. And instead, I'm introduced to a 5'6" guy who's sitting. He's sunk into a couch. He's shaped like a pumpkin. And when he opens his mouth, he sounds like one of the magpies to an old Warner Brothers cartoon. And in my head, in my heart, I find I guess I had a kind of weird sinking feeling. How can this guy have done all the things that I'm going to tell you about? Okay. So he entertained me and several others for an hour and a half storytelling, and mainly funny stories about the goofy stuff that happened in the Chinese prison camp, about these kind of incidental things that have nothing to do with heroics. Okay, fine. We do 2 or 3 of these sessions, and then his daughter, I'm kind of in doubt, but I'm keeping my mouth shut. His daughter gives me a portfolio of letters. They're typed testimony that were written in the 90s in order to lobby the U.S. government to recognize this guy for his achievements. And you'll get this all later, because I'm going to sketch the whole thing out. The letters are written by former soldiers and prisoners, POWs, combat soldiers. Guys have about, at best, a high school education. These stories are vivid accounts, in some cases moment to moment, and one of them is 17 single-spaced pages, 11,000 words. I mean, that's like, for a journalist, that's a year's work, okay? It can be. These letters are written in blood and tears. And folks, when I read them, my heart sank so deep that I almost had no feelings, because there were blood and tears on the pages, because there were accounts of the worst kind of deprivation and the greatest kind of human perseverance. And every single letter was about how Teddy Rubin had saved their lives and the lives of others. Now I'm going to sketch out the story. And as I go, this is going to be really brief and fairly quick. I'm going to leave out all the details because you really have to read the book, cheap advertisement, or get it at the library. Frankly, I have nothing. I am not a shill for Penguin Random House, believe me. They don't treat writers all that well. So if you can get it for free, all the better, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to sketch out his life very briefly, and just to try and give you a sense, and maybe a couple of examples, and then leave you with a bit of a mystery. And I'll talk about that mystery a little later, but I'm going to give my own interpretation. This is going to be just the facts. Okay, Teddy was born in Hungary, lived in a small town called Pasto, an hour and a half out of Budapest. Prosperous, middle-class family, large family, and they never imagined that the war was going to reach them. I want to tell you now, the Hungarians were on the side of the Nazis in the war, okay? The Jews didn't fight for them. They were actually prohibited from joining the army. However, Hungary had an alliance with Hitler. Comes 1944, war's kind of ending. Hitler's unhappy with the performance of the Hungarian army, which has failed in the Eastern Front. The Russians have beat the pants off them for the second time. In World War I, they did the same thing. And the older kids in the family, they worry they're going to get conscripted into the army. That's what's happening. They're starting to round up Jews in the countryside. Teddy's parents, the oldest kids, 2 oldest kids, go off to Budapest to try and get away from the Nazis. They send Teddy with a bunch of Polish refugees to try and get to Switzerland, neutral country, right? They get to the border, they walk, and they hitch rides. They're on the road for a couple months, spring of 1944. It's a given, by the way, that the Nazis are starting to lose the war, or about to lose it. And they're captured. And what happens is, well, I won't go into that. Okay, I'll tell you. Kids can handle this. They're asked to drop their pants at the border. And right away, the Italian police know who they are. They're sent to a prison camp in Austria called Mauthausen. Anybody familiar with that here? Elie Wiesel was there? Right. So this is not a death camp per se. It's not a camp where there are many executions. Instead, this is a place where prisoners of the state, and they included in the beginning of the war mainly Spanish, from the Spanish Civil War, Russians, British airmen, and towards the end of the war, in the next year actually, in 1945, many of the survivors of the Hungarian Holocaust. This is a place with a quarry with what they call the 192 steps of death. It's like when the Egyptians used the Jews, the Israelites, to build the pyramids. It was a rock quarry, and they cut these rocks, and they put them on the guy's back, and they walked them up the stairs, and sometimes they fell down. People got killed. Tremendous amount of death, destruction, hangings, the works. Terrible place. But Teddy's 13. Nazis don't know what to do with him. He is fortunate in that he's sent out of the camp on a construction crew into the woods, with these Polish guys who were captured. They're civil engineers and construction guys. Nazis kind of talked them in, they talked the Nazis into letting them work a construction project. So it is here, outside of this fortress, which is impregnable, 30-foot walls in Mauthausen, that Teddy learns how to steal when the Nazis aren't looking. At night, he is hidden in the trunk, in a big piece of, they hollow out a part of a tree, and he lays there all night, and then in the middle of the night, he gets up, and when there's nobody around the dump, he goes and steals food. He steals the remains of what the SS don't eat, because they still feed the prisoners like dogs. Even if they don't, the Nazis aren't going to eat it, they're not going to let the prisoners take it. So he learns a lot in this camp. He's liberated, and then, of course, the guys he's with are killed. Everything bad happens. He's starving. He's very fortunate that at May 5th or May 6th, I'm not sure which date, we're unsure, the Patton's 11th Armored Division bangs down the doors, the huge doors, and he is saved. So he and the survivors of his family, parents were killed, but brothers and sisters survived because they fled and got away from the Nazis, spent 3 years in a DP camp. He comes to New York in 1948. Finally, they allow some Hungarians, and teenagers in particular, to come, even though every Hungarian is considered a hostile because they fought on the side, or they were on the side of Hitler, the country. Gets to this country, barely speaks English, joins the army. Now, his friends and family thought he was out of his mind, but he insisted that he had a debt to the U.S., and he loved the country. He loved it since he was a kid. He had first experienced America in the movies. He watched Frankenstein 4 times. He worshipped Tarzan, cowboys, Jimmy Cagney. He wanted to come here. He was terrible at Hebrew, never learned a thing. He was ostracized as a lousy student. Father told him he'd never amount to anything, wanted to come to America. So, in America, joins the army, has the bad fortune upon arrival in Korea, after he's told that he doesn't have to go because he's not a U.S. citizen. He's told that he can go, they'll send him to Germany. Well, he's not going to go to Germany. Or they'll send him someplace else. No, he wants to stay with the guys who he trained with. Unfortunately, on the beach in Korea, his company gets a new master sergeant, a veteran of World War II. This veteran, this master sergeant, by the name of Watson, announces to the boys, the 160 guys in his company, that if you're not from Texas or the South, you don't rate. And if you're black, Mexican, or a Jew, you better forget it, because he will not handle, or he just doesn't want anything to do with any one of those people. Well, there's a funny talking guy in the company, a little guy, 5'6", kind of handsome, and he talks with a funny accent. The sergeant grabs his tag. He says, well, what's this here? H, what does this mean? Because he heard, you're Hungarian? Tibor says, no, Hebrew. Okay, trouble. He says, why aren't you back with the other Jews in New York making big bucks? He says, well, I'm pretty stupid. He says, you're damn right you're stupid. What the hell are you doing over here? He says, well, Sergeant, I volunteer. Volunteer, eh? Well, from that day forward, Watson begins to assign Teddy to the most dangerous missions. He sends him on reconnaissance. He puts him out alone to watch the tanks. And every time, and he sends him out to all manner he sends him out with South Koreans who are working with him, who might be North Korean imposters and might slit his throat in the middle of the night, as they had done with so many others of our guys. Teddy always comes back. The sergeant says, what is it with you Jews? You got 9 lives, you're like cats. Then one day, the worst. We are losing the war in the beginning of this conflict, summer of 1950. The North Koreans have taken most of the peninsula. We are in retreat. The company is told to leave a hill. Problem with the hill. There's a big ammo dump. Huge. And they are told to leave a few guys behind to keep it from falling into enemy hands. The sergeant volunteers Teddy Rubin, leaves him alone. 160 guys leave the hill. 1 guy's left on the hill by himself. Teddy calls out to God. He says, what's the matter? Why did you leave me here? You put me through the Nazi terror, and now you're going to kill me here. No answer. He curses God. No answer to that either. He gets desperate. He looks around. He's got nothing to do. It's 1 a.m. They'd promised to come back from him. They didn't come back. He goes back to the ammo dump. First he breaks out the K rations and eats all the candy bars. Then he gets hand grenades, and he figures, well, I'm going to die, but I might as well die fighting. He starts to take armfuls of hand grenades and brings them to the front line, dropping them in the foxholes that overlook the precipice. That happens, there's still no action. He goes and he gets ammo belts from the machine guns. He takes those to the front, fills the machine gun mounts, mortar shells, piles them up near the mortar, sits there, nothing happens. 4 a.m, just before dawn, he sees the Koreans, hundreds of them below. Okay. What to do? Nothing. They start blowing bugles, whistles. They played bagpipes. That was the way the North Koreans tried to scare away they scared away before they attacked. It was their signal to get ready. Teddy starts tossing grenades down the hill, rolling them down the hill, lobbing them. He moves from one foxhole to the next. He doesn't even know what he's doing at some point. Fires machine guns at them. There's a haze he can't see, has no idea what's going on. Well, he holds them off. He holds them off until daylight. American planes come, and the American planes chase them away. So I'm going to read you just a little bit from the book about his reaction, so you get the kind of guy that he was. He stumbled back to his unit. They didn't believe. He said, I just killed hundreds of gooks. They didn't believe him. The captain and the sergeant, who hated him, and a couple of other guys went back by jeep, and this is what they saw. There was no mistaking what had occurred. The far side of the hill was carpeted with dead and dying North Koreans. Many were sprawled among the shredded remains of others, as if they had tripped and become stuck in their own ravaged flesh. Hands and feet lay scattered about like empty weapons that had been absently dropped and left. A pyramid of bodies was piled just below an overhang, only 10 or 15 feet beneath the forward line of foxholes. Each man appeared to have been stopped in the act of stepping over the man below him. Farther down the grade, a patchwork of gravely wounded young men gasped to breathe or cried for help or struggled to hold in their entrails. Tibor began to cry. He hadn't pictured what the battlefield would look like, that death could appear in so many horrid forms. Up to that second, the entire experience had seemed fuzzy and distant, but now there were scores of bodies in front of him, some positioned like question marks, their dead eyes asking him why he had killed them. Tortured voices of the wounded called for water or their mothers, just like so many American GIs after they'd been hit. Tibor's thoughts went to one of the central values of his faith. Long ago, he had been taught that the worst shame came from vile deeds forced upon you by your enemies. You would reach the lowest point of existence when you struck back at those who struck at you. As Tibor faced the destruction that he'd single-handedly visited on so many young people not so different from him, he felt the deep hurt of a failure that went beyond the personal and that violated the most sacred laws of God. Then he began to sob in a way that he had never before. So, you get a sense of the sort of guy he was. Now, his captain nominated him for the Medal of Honor. The sergeant ditched the paperwork. The war continues. Tibor refuses R&R. He goes on to fight with the guys. There were several other amazing things. This guy who's fearless guy, these acts of heroism he performs. Then in November of 50, just 4 months after the war began, basically, or 5 months, he is engaged in what becomes known as the Little Big Horn of Korea. His entire company and battalion, 3 battalions in fact, 2,500 men, are decimated. His battalion is completely decimated. He is captured by the Chinese and sent, because the Chinese have entered the war basically when the Koreans have failed to protect their country. So, he's sent to a Chinese prison camp with about 200 survivors of that 800-man battalion. This is the coldest winter in 100 years. The North Koreans didn't take prisoners. The Chinese took the prisoners. There is no food. There is they're simply, the supply lines are being bombed by the Americans and their UN allies, and the river is frozen. So the Chinese have no medical supplies for their own. They've got these guys they had appropriated a part of a small town along the Yala River. In fact, they'd appropriated several of them along the river because they got more and more prisoners. And they have very little food to feed them. And there's no medical supplies. So his guys are scared to death. There are about 20 guys in a little house in this community. There are 200 houses, barbed wire fence around the place. What does Tibor Rubin do? Tibor Rubin first he sneaks out of the house in the middle of the night, and it's freezing cold. He goes to the Chinese storehouses, waits until there's nobody around, and the Chinese don't want to be out in minus 30 degrees either. Bursts in, he finds they don't have any food. They have the same crap that they're feeding the POWs. It's a little bit of grain. They're getting a half tin a day. So, okay, he's a failure at that. He starts sneaking out of camp at night under the barbed wire, which fortunately, unlike the Nazi barbed wire, is not electrified. He goes into the local community, goes to the farms, raids the farms. He is smart. He's grown up on farms. He knows there's a crust of ice, bangs through the ice and finds in the fields the leftovers from the last harvest, because farmers would leave some things for the next year, so they cultivated the field. He knew that. He was smart. He also knew techniques. He had learned techniques in Mauthausen, where there was no medicine for Jews, or any of the prisoners. When a man got sick, he was sent to the infirmary, he got a lethal shot. If he was badly wounded, he was shot. Teddy had learned things. He'd learned that if you put maggots on gangrenous wounds, the maggots would eat the gangrenous flesh, and then you pull them off, and the flesh would heal. Now, it didn't save people all the time, but it did sometimes. So here's a guy laying in the house. Nobody knows what to do with him. His name is James Bourgeois. He's a soft-spoken Tennessee guy. Never saw a Jew before in his life. Teddy didn't even know the guy. The guy's got mortar shell wounds that are so severe, his arms are almost separated from his shoulders. Teddy goes to the latrine. Jumps in the latrine. You know what's there. Runs his hands through the human feces. Washes them off in the snow. Takes the maggots. Sticks them on the man's wounds. The other guys think he's out of his mind. He's crazy. They don't know what to think. He's a funny-talking foreigner. The maggots eat the gangrene. He takes the maggots off, washes the guy's arms. The guy survives. So this goes on for basically the first 6 months of the war, where things are literally the worst. And 1,600 of our 4,000 prisoners died of starvation or their wounds or the deep depression that they call give-up-itis, which was just as deadly. Then the spring and summer happen, the river thaws, and they begin to bring supplies down. And they bring new uniforms, spring uniforms to replace these putrid remains of their uniforms. Also, a powder to get rid of lice, and better food. So at any rate, Teddy spends the next 2 years making the Chinese crazy. They try and re-educate our prisoners, and he leads the resistance. Come April of '53, he is sent home before the end of the war because one of his war wounds festers, he gets osteomyelitis, and only a Chinese female doctor saves his life by operating on him. See, the Chinese didn't want our guys dead. We had 80,000 of them, and they only had 5,000 or 6,000 of ours. So they wanted to keep our guys alive and also to try and indoctrinate them into communism, which was a terrible failure. So Teddy goes back in '53. And he doesn't say a word about his heroism to anybody. He is identified as a foreigner, and they ask him what the hell he's doing in the army. He says, I was a prisoner of the Nazis, and his picture goes all over the AP wire. It's printed all over New York, all of the newspapers all over the country, but he never says anything about the great things that he did. 30 years go by. I'm not going to get into why. Later on, I'll talk to the next group, but there is stuff in the book about this, but it was a great mystery as to why he didn't say anything, but didn't say a word to anybody. 1980, he goes to a POW convention, the first. His kids are grown up. They're leaving the house. He is sort of freed from his obligations. He meets up with a sergeant, not Watson, but another sergeant who liked him a lot and actually tried to help him get the medal. And the first thing is they're shocked to see one another alive. And the second thing out of the sergeant's mouth is, where are your medals? You know, the Medal of Honor. This guy had actually written accounts because he knew that the captains had, the Sergeant Watson, had ditched the stuff, and he actually had written a detailed depiction of what occurred. So, here's what happens. This sergeant basically finds all the survivors of the POW camp and item company, and they mount a campaign which ultimately entailed the Jewish war veterans and several other organizations, but mainly the Jewish War Veterans of America. They lobby the Army for the next 25 years to get the medal. These are 7 or 8 Gentiles who never saw a Jew before, okay? They never saw a Jew before they were in the Army. This Jew had saved their lives. And these guys who had suffered terrible what they now call stress disorder, but they had suffered horribly the ravages and their memories of things that occurred, all the terrible things in the war and shortly thereafter. These guys got together and to their dying breath, and most of them died before it was achieved, got Teddy the medal. He got it in 2005, and it took basically an act of Congress to have him even considered because of the statute of limitations. So, finally, in this, the most unlikely of things occurred. A man's heroism was beyond the call of duty over and over and over again. He was not a spirited warrior. He was not a killer or a shooter by nature. He was a guy who basically saved lives and fought when he had to fight. So, what are we to make of all this? I wasn't sure. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I spent a lot of time thinking about how he was built. I talked to friends of his from back in Europe. A guy said, well, he was made a hero in the cradle. I knew that he had become fearless, and it's a very hard thing to conceive that to even say this, it sounds like an apostasy, that he learned in the Holocaust. But somehow, this terrible experience of the Nazi terror helped build this amazing hero. So, here I am tonight, 4 years after I started the project. I can't say how gratifying it is to be able to share this with you. And mainly, I'm happy to see that there are a lot of people who are a lot younger than most of you and a lot younger than me, because really, it's this story and stories like this that I think need to go on to younger people. Having said that, I just am going to conclude with something I read that was written by Elie Wiesel, and it definitely applies to my experience. It's a little quote. Sometimes it happens that we travel a long time without knowing that we have made the long journey, solely pronounce a certain word, a certain phrase, in a certain place. The meaning of the place and the word is a rare accomplishment. I thank you very much for allowing me that opportunity to share these accomplishments. Thank you.